members of the University Executive, Conference Organizing Committee, and colleagues. As we know, research actively informs the standing of effective educational practices. The search for quality in teaching in higher education is driven by the professionalism of academics and various stakeholders in very competitive environments. In such contexts, synergies are important for educators who believe research happens in and around their work. Synergies are important also for researchers who want to be educators through the work they do and its dissemination. It is also the case that there are inconsistent expectations among policymakers, politicians, researchers, and practitioners about the quality of educational research that serves as investigative practice. These ideas have created a growing body of research in the field of teacher professional development and learning. And in the middle of all this, the global pandemic has thrown many things out of balance for many of us. For example, it has seriously disrupted traditional models of teaching and learning in higher education. That's the field that we are interested in here. Additionally, the pandemic has focused our attention on how best to adjust to the needs of higher education in times marked by changes in mobility, digital communication, and new ways of working. In moving forward, we need to engage with these complexities as opportunities for innovation, research, and learning. Innovative approaches require critical scrutiny, and this means reflective practice that is reflexive and integrated in rigorous research conducted by individuals, groups of colleagues, institutions, and even between institutions internationally. This will allow evidence-based evaluation of innovations and research methodologies. This will advance professional learning and development of academics as both teachers and researchers. And these will provide the foundations for institutional learning and change. These ideas underpin my presentation today. During my presentation, I try to consider aspects of how to better inform practice and how to better improve research on that practice as part of an ongoing conversation among the attendees of this conference. I'm sure contributors to the discussion and debates of this conference will consider a range of issues about the ways in which we think about practice and the value and importance of practice in advancing the education of all students. Practice as a construct in education is described and evaluated in several ways. In educational terms, a practice may involve any strategy, curriculum, program, or more broadly, any planned or unplanned intervention. The description of practice is dependent on the purpose and place of its occurrence. Everyday practice can be described as repeated, as fluent, as habitual part of life that is seen as part of a natural order. A culture of practice can be discussed as implicit or explicit ways of thinking and functioning that are shared by members of a social group and maintained by intergenerational transmission. Professional practice can be described as co-activity that enables practitioners of some craft to construct standards that justify and legitimate their membership of a community of practice. Practice can also be described in relation to informing research. Research and evidence help clarify the professional boundaries in educational practice. The language of the science of educational practice can be described in several prototypical phrases. For example, practice can be viewed as evidence-based and empirically grounded or not. And the science of practice can be characterized as applied and rigorous or not. When practice and research are brought together, the language of practice evaluation can be used to characterize some practice as either best, recommended, quality, and promising practice, or controversial and poorly informed practice. For example, some educational practices can be described as evidence-based. Others cannot, either because the research has not been done or because the available research does not support the practice. I acknowledge that academic opinion about action research as a research strategy is mixed. Action research has a considerable history, and there are many who advocate it. Also, there are numerous criticisms directed at action research of being unempirical or unscientific. Even advocates of action research point to shortcomings in the rigor and reliability of reported action research, its confinement to local settings, how data are collected and analyzed, how biases are negotiated, and how the action research cycle is enacted. And the list goes on. Some of these limitations of action research need to be addressed, and in its defense, we can look to advocates of action research who provide strong cases for the integrity of action research as a model of learning in higher education. Even so, many in the higher education sector give a lesser status to action research, and this discourages higher educators, especially those outside the field of education, from engaging in research focused on their practice. And to make matters worse, most institutions prioritize academic research and publication outcomes that focus on specific areas, which means that the attention of research to teaching or learning is often marginalized. I strongly argue that the recognition of action research as an applied science in teaching and learning can make a decisive disciplinary contribution to high-quality teaching. Instead of prioritizing only disciplinary research, universities should look for ways to promote the value of action research as a form of educational research central to teaching, learning, and research. Instead of working within the boundaries of the status quo, action research must question how discourses and ideologies are constructed, not only in practice, but also in the context of practice. To go beyond the scope of action research as an instrument for evaluation of teaching and assessment practices, or as a model for professional development, questions need to be raised about assumptions that underlie practice. Learning and change in practice require questioning assumptions about teaching practice and their goals. Action research provides a process for professional and teacher learning, and this process is embedded not only in the review of assumptions about what or how teachers learn, but also in the realization that questioning these assumptions is an indispensable dimension of learning. My own research has shown that deep-seated assumptions about how we think have a significant impact on teacher practice. In teaching critical thinking skills to international students in Australia, we found that teachers of critical thinking skills often do not apply these skills to their own assumptions about the meanings of backgrounds of students and how these meanings shape classroom practices. In the field of language teach educators often fail to question their understandings of phenomena at the center of language teaching and learning. And this can lead to practices that are not necessarily student focused or ethical. It is not new to combine action research with efforts to improve teacher practice and student learning. Action research is described as a practice changing practice and therefore a meta practice that changes people's practices, their understandings of their practices, and the conditions under which they practice. We must acknowledge also that all attempts to change and improve practices do not necessarily employ the strategic reflexive processes of action research. Unfortunately, however, under the influence of managerial ideologies and linear product-oriented conceptions of learning, the focus on quality in teaching and learning and the promotion of professional learning about teaching in higher education can generate a gap between what teachers learn as theory and how that learning translates to practice. As we know, teaching is a situated and complex activity. Our understanding of how we learn about teaching must consider the relationship between teacher learning and teacher practice. That process requires rejection of linear conceptualizations of the connection between teacher learning and practice. This is typical of much of what is described as action research. The recursive and reflexive approach to action research shifts the focus away from product process orientation and offers a tailored, practical alternative to dualistic approaches. Now, that allows us to mix teacher learning and teaching practice as interwoven and entrapped in the activities of both. Non-dualistic thinking about learning and practice allows practitioners to think of teacher learning and teacher practice as entangled in the activity of learning practice. It shifts the focus from the individual teacher as the architect of change within the classroom to the need to practice action research with the understanding that classrooms and learning are co-constructed. Teachers are actors with considerable influence on the social world outside the classroom. And any activity that tries to change what happens in a classroom must start with the understanding that others' actions and influences of material and non-material factors reflexively shape the actions of all participants. Understanding the complexity of these relationships is key for teachers to understand the processes of their own learning that emerges during action research. When we see the consistency between the principles and practices of action research and the processes of learning, practice of teachers, I think we are right to argue that action research is a powerful tool for learning about how we can approach improving the quality of teaching in higher education. It gives us a research strategy with a sound conceptual foundation for contributing important research to what we know about teaching and learning. I'm now turning to the disruption resulting from the global pandemic, a situation that calls for urgent attention on how we can continue to learn from our practice so that our students can reach their full potential. At the moment, the pandemic is the greatest challenge we share as teachers in higher education, and a circumstance that demands we rethink much about how and why we teach. Universities around the world have moved their courses online to prevent the spread of COVID-19. Many institutions continue to remain in this situation. This is a good time to ask challenging questions about what is normal, what is traditional, and how traditional teaching methods on campus can ensure high quality teaching that best serves the interests and needs of our students. As practitioners and action researchers, we must not only question our efforts, but also how we can adapt to new circumstances. I think our response to the pandemic is an expectation that at some point in the near future, teaching will return to normal. The question that is central to the current situation and that concerns most teachers is whether high quality online teaching and learning can replace face-to-face instruction. Of course, I understand we have all been asking many of these questions already before any pandemic forced us to change the ways we worked. Many institutions already had online learning management systems in operation, both to allow off-campus enrollments and to complement and enrich face-to-face delivery or to integrate on and off-campus students. Studies conducted in Australia prior to the pandemic, these found that many academics gave low priority to online teaching because they lacked the skills and experience to teach online. Surprisingly, many teachers in higher education have no personal experience of studying online as learners. And in response to the sudden shift to online teaching, and without any appropriate training or support, many have coped by simply uploading face-to-face teaching materials. Action research is a practice-changing practice, the aim of which is always to change practice for the better. So I guess this is a time for learning for all of us. Cultivating an institutional culture that values practice-changing practices in academic research, in our own teaching, and in the participation of students as co-researchers. Now, that provides an opportunity to contribute to the completion of institutional change at the center. Now, my own field of teaching English to speakers of other languages is a prime example of the contemporary international flow of knowledge and learning practices as universities in the global north and institutions in the global south, as they grapple with policies demanding the introduction of English as the medium of instruction. The dependence on a model of professional teacher learning based on importation of pedagogies via either travel of teachers to English dominant locations or by bringing in experts from those countries can open a Pandora's box of problems when we attempt to make international professional development experiences relevant to the local contexts. In these situations, action research can provide a valid research pathway for academics in the global south to work in environments where opportunities for funded research are scarce, or professional learning is equated with travels to more privileged institutions in the north. We must respond in our own classrooms and institutions to new challenges and new times as researchers and teachers. We must emphasize the importance of cooperation in disseminating research findings. Our actions should contextualize local problems and circumstances globally, and our practices should incorporate connections and commonalities that we share. For our mutual benefit, we can strengthen transnational links by sharing our insights, findings, and conclusions, and by contextualizing the local globally. Action research and its practice must recognize the potential it offers to play a central role in the work of individuals, communities, and universities contributing to teaching, learning, and research. This in turn means developing and refining the methods of action research and the research capacities of fellow academics and their students. The impact of this exercise could be far-reaching if conducted ethically, rigorously, and with an orientation to the wider global higher education community. While recognizing the local and unique circumstances of efforts to teach and learn, especially in places like post-colonial and post-conflict Sri Lanka, we can see that there are shared expectations, experiences, dilemmas, and opportunities. The needs of students in Sri Lankan higher education are not far from those of students elsewhere, and the practices and insights of action research can be shared in other parts of the world to make a difference in classrooms and institutions. Action research provides a platform for educators and researchers to create, communicate, and maintain dialogues with like-minded people and institutions with similar concerns. Those who respond to the demands of changing circumstances do their best to question their practices and assumptions and to make changes with the goal of achieving better outcomes will definitely offer their students the opportunities and skills to do the same. And with that note, I end my presentation, and thank you very much for the opportunity once again.